Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. If you can't tell, I am currently on vacation. I'm actually currently in my hotel room right now. Apologize for the decor. We do with what we can. In this particular case, I've got 3 album reviews on the docket. Just friendly warning, just like vacation last year, the reviews are going to be bucketed together a little bit more handheld, a little bit more sporadic. You all know what it is. I've been doing this for the past 3 to 4 years. But without further ado, given that the weather's kind of miserable, I figured metal should be on the docket. Starting off with... You know what? This might be a first for me, where I'm actually doing a review from a band that I have seen them live first before I actually reviewed any of their albums, or listened to any of their albums. Actually, I currently own their merch, so take of that what you will. Trust me, I'm still impartial here somewhat. Anyway, let's talk about Falls of Rauros. They're a band in the black metal scene, a little bit more on the atmospheric side. Pretty much can win me over on that most of the time, but I've often found a lot of the albums coming out of this scene, and particularly from Falls of Rauros, they've got a lot of strident melody, but they don't do a lot to really stand out amidst the pack. Unless the melodies are absolutely transcendent, and that can be fairly rare, you look at other textural elements or lyrical elements to bring them through. And I'll be honest, when Falls of Rauros started off, they didn't really have a lot. Yeah, the guitar work was phenomenal. I'll give them a lot of credit there, but at the same time, they had issues with transitions, the production was never great, and it's been a growing process to get to this point where they're touring for their newest album. And I gotta say, it might be one of their best to date. The guitar work, as always, is scintillating and has a lot of really impactful layers. The solos, when you get a chance to really delve into them, has a lot of meat to them. I do wish some of the brighter tones were a little closer to the front of the mix, but honestly, this is probably the best they've been over the course of the past decade. I'll also say this, I really like a lot of the lyrics here. A lot of this particular album is delving into the failures of human myth and how we as humanity have to reconcile that. We see the patterns in humanity, the belief systems that we put up crumble time and time again, and thus, when confronted with this, being able to effectively set them aside, be they reasoned or otherwise. So often people will believe in them and fall in line. Maybe where it goes from there is some uncertainty, but being able to embrace that uncertainty is freeing in its own way. And while the language that Falls of Rauros might be a little overdeveloped for its own sake, it's poetry that's clearly a little impressed with itself. At the same time, it's good poetry. I like the thematic arc on this album. It coalesces well over these 6 songs. That's not saying that there aren't some issues here. I will say that if we're putting them on a tier of black metal, I wouldn't put them among my favorites. The Sayor's got nothing to worry about, neither does Panopticon. And I do think that there are absolutely segments with this band where they have issues with transitions, particularly when they go into a bassier, heavier section in that mold. It often feels like you're going into that lane with an audible clunk, and that's not the best fit for them. At the same time, while the melodies that they do bring to bear can be really strong, I wouldn't put them up among the best of the scene, and given that these bands don't really give a shit about hooks, I'm okay with that to a point. Still though, this album has only grown on me with future listens. I was generally impressed with them. I was even more impressed seeing them live, if you can't tell, and yeah, very light 8 out of 10. If you're into this brand of atmospheric black metal, that's probably their most meticulous and heaviest to date. It's worth it. Meaty stuff, I dig it. Check it out.
Satan, 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 get beside me.
Oh boy, this album. Yeah, I was planning on getting this review out before I left on vacation, but given its length and the heaviness of the subject matter, time got away from me, and I wanted to bucket it in this subset of reviews, and honestly, it's the sort of album that requires a lot of time and emotional energy to take in. If you've heard it, you understand, but to provide some context, Lingua Ignota is an experimental musician who flirts across a lot of different genres. On the one hand, you get elements of baroque pop or even opera in some of her delivery, but then balanced out against the doom elements and traces of expressive black metal and noise and industrial, and really even some ambient textures if you pay attention to the background. And really, if you pay attention to the background, you'll hear a lot more disturbing undercurrents than even you'll see at the foreground. That's the other thing with this album. It is very difficult to take in, even in comparison with her debut, which came out a couple of years ago and was reissued on Profound Lore. This album basically is a refinement and an expansion of a lot of similar themes that she brought up on that debut, and to say it's hard to take in might be understating it. I don't normally start off reviews like this with any sort of trigger warning or anything like that, but just if you're curious about this album and you potentially have been in an abusive relationship or you're still suffering trauma from that, this album won't be for you. It honestly cuts into some elements that are too deep, too primal, too emotive to really take in effectively, and it touches on that subject matter pretty aggressively, both in terms of the content where you'll see her directly delving into the emotional manipulation that comes in that sort of relationship, but also the levels and depths of rage that's almost been amplified by a certain level of Catholic angst. And yet what gives the emotional intensity so much impact is that you can clearly tell at some root here there was love, there was passion, there was something real, and then it's curdled into something that is so toxic and delivered with so much blunt force. Really, the singer here she is incredible as a performer alone. A lot of this album is carried on her vocals, from the clearer, the prettier vocals to the point where she's breaking down and borderline sobbing to the points where she's screaming through distorted filters. And even though I can tell they're distorted filters, it doesn't take away from the impact. The production highlights how cavernous and thunderous an album like this is. It's a monstrous listen. So much so that it runs over an hour, and I kind of get why. It kind of has to. And that's not even touching on some of the deeper elements of themes and subtext. An album like this, for as blunt as a lot of the language is, how the bluntness is framed actually calls upon some pretty interesting elements. Take a couple songs in where you can tell that she's having conversations with Satan, as Satan might be the only person who could potentially stand by and validate the women who are cast into flames by a larger society without them. This is an album that explores the trauma that comes out of broken relationships and abusive relationships, but the one thing that it does, it leans into a distinctly feminine side of that conversation. So if you're expecting charging riffs, or you're expecting a traditional macho approach, you're not gonna get it. The song structures lean into the feminine, but also a feminine rage. But when framed with this level of baroque, gothic, Catholic presence, honestly, it's a little unsettling, especially coming up in that background myself. Now, I will say, I do have a few issues with the album as a whole, or as much as it is a noisy, abrasive, cavernous experience that can run long, it does run long at a couple spots. I do feel that some of the repetitive mantra-like structures could have been tightened up a little bit more. For as good as she is at crafting melodies and refocusing on the human element, I do wish there was a little bit more to tie the larger picture together. Also, some of the vocal affectation she uses can pull you out of an experience a little bit. The one case is that on a couple songs she braces almost a gargling vocal affect, which, yeah, I get that it's unearthly and alien, and I get that's part of the point, but it also kind of sounds like a Muppet. That kind of yanked me out of it. It's hard to ignore once you hear it, that's all. But overall, yeah, this is something to behold. I'm not quite as high on it as some people are. I know some people are calling this album of the year material, and I can't quite do that, given that it's not a project I'm really inclined to revisit. I put it in the same category as the last Daughters album, You Won't Get What You Want, even though I think this is a shade bit weaker in terms of lacking some of that structure. Similar case for The Terror by the Flaming Lips, albums that more rely on that sort of primal, animalistic fear, but it's so innately grounded and human that it cuts you all the same. It's a scary album. It's the sort of album that gets under your skin in a way that a lot of other metal doesn't, which is why I'm giving it an extremely strong 8 out of 10 and the highest of my recommendations. But if you want an album that doesn't really turn out to be as scary when placed in contrast, What? As if I could film this review anywhere else. Okay, you know what? All jokes aside, I actually don't think that's being entirely fair to Slipknot, but that's mostly because Slipknot and I kind of fall into a bit of an odd position. I don't dislike this band. I think the more important thing to emphasize here is that I never had the angry white boy phase where I could be able to get this band on a more primal level. The band came out probably a little bit before my time, if I'm being honest, and in a nu metal wave that I wasn't really interested in. I've described this before, but I kind of went from pop music and country pretty much straight into symphonic metal. So a lot of the radio-leaning nu metal, or even the heavier stuff just adjacent to it, where I would typically deposit Slipknot, I missed it. I didn't really get the appeal at the time. And going back to it now, I still don't really see a lot of the appeal for Slipknot. I gotta be honest with you guys, folks. I went back through their entire discography. I listened to all of their albums, including this one, multiple times, and I see the appeal. I genuinely do. I think they're probably a phenomenal live act. When I actually took a look at some of the live recordings, they sounded really fresh and great. I really appreciated that. And on some level, I get the visceral, meathead, edgelord, in-your-face style that they would otherwise put forward. There is an audience for that, and I'll admit, when I listen to Eminem at certain points, I kind of get that, but there's also a little bit more depth to Eminem. There was more emotionality to balance out the nihilism, and there was also some insightful commentary, and Slipknot didn't really have a lot of that. I think part of my larger issue with the band is that they were just never as catchy as I would want to put them in that category. Yeah, the hooks occasionally came together, but the albums always felt spotty and way too long for a lot of their subject matter. The lyrics almost uniformly were crap. And for as much as I can respect Corey Taylor as a singer, and for as visceral as he can shift back and forth between his shouting, his screaming, some of his sung vocals never quite conveyed the same level of menace that his screams did, and the rapping was always embarrassing. Let's just establish that now. Whenever Slipknot tried to do rapping, it was bad. So, okay, going back to this now. Again, I see the appeal, I see why so many people are high on this album, but on some level, you're seeing an example of Slipknot in a bit of a crossroads, and Slipknot's also in a situation where I think they're struggling to find an identity when they can't shock people in the same way anymore. They certainly aren't shocking me, and I think that's one of the reasons why I couldn't really take them seriously as a band, because I've heard death metal, I've heard black metal, I've heard grindcore. I just reviewed Lingua Ignota, and when you have albums like Caligula that are as visceral and haunting and emotionally scarring as that is, you go to Slipknot and I'm like, okay, that's it? That's all you're bringing to the table? I'm sorry, this brand of meat-headed nihilism, while you rely on similar levels of blunt language, there's no sense of good pacing. You're more intent to rely on hooks, and the levels of depth and atmosphere just are not there. So when they don't shock me, and realize that shock factor is a huge factor to why Slipknot stuck around so long, I start looking for other elements that would try to keep them interesting. And honestly, there's just not a ton that really grabs me. I always think that their grooves are a little bit undercooked. They tend to rely on a lot of clanking percussion over really steady, solid bass lines that don't really feel well mic'd. I think that this album in particular does get some of the dirtier, filthier riffs to the forefront, leaning into the modern edge of nu metal side that you're hearing in bands like Fever 333 and acts in that vein. And Corey Taylor can still sell a lot of these songs. And you know what? I'll give Slipknot credit. When they get on a good melody, and they do a couple times on this album, they come together pretty effectively. I still can't take the lyrics seriously. I'm still not convinced that Corey Taylor is a great songwriter in that lane, and I'm never impressed by a lot of the depth. They feel kind of two-dimensional pretty consistently with this brand of sadomasochistic nihilism. But at the same time, for this band of dumb fun, I can see elements that would work. But the problem is that there's a lot of misspent experiments here. They try to go for some symphonic elements that never have the gravitas they should, mostly because they go for these very shrill, teeny female backing singers instead of anything with a male baritone presence. I still don't think they can handle creepy very well. They try to lean on some electronic elements that are very poorly implemented, and for some ungodly reason, the hip-hop elements are still here, because you get scratch scratching, you get break beats, you got places where the song just stutter out for a little bit, and they're as faintly embarrassing now as they were 15 to 20 years ago. I'm not a fan, they don't work. They're always an element to Slipknot that highlights one of their greatest weaknesses, and honestly, a very tired trend they could have left back 15 years ago. At the same time though, I'm not gonna disparage this album for doing what it is, because it is a Slipknot album. It will play to the fans. As far as I know, a lot of fans really do adore this project. I don't, but again, this is a band I've never grew up with, never felt in the same way. I was never shocked by them, I was never really scared by them. Like, if I'm gonna compare them to Lingua Ignota for a second, that's a hardcore horror movie that gets in your skin you're gonna remember for years to come. Whereas listening to like a Slipknot album, it's a Saw movie. It's a gore fest. I can't take it seriously, but occasionally I can have a laugh at it. But the problem is that if you're gonna rely on Slipknot in that lane, some of their characteristic problems are still here. They don't lean enough into stronger tunes. The album still runs way too long, especially for the amount of lyrical and conceptual song ideas they have, and it just never gets quite as gritty or gristly as it really could. And thus for me, sorry guys, I know some of you really wanted me to jump on board, but it's a strong 5 out of 10. It's not for me. I fully acknowledge that, but honestly, there's still problems here that they haven't gotten rid of. That's why it's as it is. Take that as you will.